I wasn't looking for giants when I started this investigation. I was researching Tartaria, that vast territory marked on European maps between the 1500s and 1800s, trying to understand why it disappeared. Standard historical curiosity, the kind of thing you file away as geographic terminology updates and move on. But then I found the newspaper reports. Not folklore, not myths passed down through generations of embellishment. Newspaper reports. Hundreds of them. Published in the New York Times. Local papers across America. Respected journals throughout the 1800s and early 1900s. Reports of human skeletons measuring 7, 8, sometimes 12 feet tall, discovered in burial mounds from coast to coast. The pattern was consistent. Farmer plows up a mound. Workers dig a foundation. Construction crew excavates for a railroad. And there, beneath feet of earth, skeletons of extraordinary size, not scattered anomalies, systematic findings. The accounts describe organized burial sites, artifacts suggesting advanced knowledge, remains that challenged everything we understood about who lived here before European contact. Then something changed. After approximately 1920, these reports stop, not gradually, abruptly. Discoveries that were once front-page news simply ceased to appear, and that's when I noticed something else. The timing. The giant skeleton reports peak in the exact decades when Tartaria disappears from maps, when encyclopedias stop referencing this vast civilization, when the architectural record suggests something existed that official history no longer acknowledges. The question became unavoidable. Were these connected? Were the giants the builders, the protectors, the administrative class of a civilization we've been taught to forget? Let me show you what I found. In 1885, the New York Times reported a 7-foot skeleton discovered in a Michigan mound. In 1895, the San Diego Union documented bones of extraordinary size found during railroad excavation. In 1899, the Middletown Signal described giant human remains uncovered in Ohio. These weren't tabloid sensations. Where's mainstream newspapers reporting what was, at the time, considered newsworthy, but not particularly controversial? The accounts describe skeletons measuring 7 to 12 feet in length, often found in organized burial sites, frequently accompanied by artifacts, copper ornaments, weapons, ceremonial objects that suggested these weren't primitive people, but individuals with access to metallurgy and construction knowledge. In West Virginia, the St. Louis Dispatch covered excavations in 1891, where multiple skeletons over 7 feet tall were discovered, with copper bracelets and ceremonial items. In Minnesota, newspapers described remains found embedded in granite rock beneath 7 feet of earth, in carefully constructed graves. In Janesville, Wisconsin, the Public Ledger reported a 13-foot example unearthed in 1870. Burial mounds across the American continent containing remains of unusually large individuals. Discoveries made by ordinary people, farmers, workers, archaeological teams, and consistently, these bones were sent somewhere. The Smithsonian Institution, for further study, for analysis, for proper documentation, and then they vanished. The Smithsonian now claims no such skeletons exist in their collections. Missing, lost, misplaced during routine transfers, hundreds of specimens, all gone without proper documentation. While researching these newspaper accounts, I started noticing patterns in period architecture, buildings from the 1700s and 1800s, with features that seem at first glance absurdly oversized. Government buildings with doorways 12 to 15 feet high, not at grand entrances where such heights make aesthetic sense. In back hallways, in working corridors where grandeur serves no purpose. Courthouses across America with staircases requiring enormous strides, the risers so tall, a normal person must stretch uncomfortably to climb them. Administrative buildings throughout Europe with the same proportions. In St. Petersburg, back hallways with 12-foot doors. In Buenos Aires, municipal structures with staircases that feel wrong for human scale. In Delhi, colonial-era government buildings containing furniture that makes a 6-foot man feel like a child. These weren't ceremonial spaces. These were working buildings, offices, administrative centers. The everyday architecture of governance and oversight. The official explanation is aesthetic choice, that architects designed buildings this way for grandeur, for intimidation, for visual impact. But that explanation ignores something crucial: the cost, the impracticality, the simple fact that making everything larger requires more materials, more labor, more structural engineering, all for spaces that supposedly served normal-sized humans. Unless they didn't. What if the scale wasn't aesthetic? What if it was functional? What if these buildings were designed for the people who actually use them? And that's where the Tartaria connection becomes impossible to ignore. Tartaria appears on European maps from the 1500s through the early 1800s as a vast territory spanning northern Asia. Not a legend, not a myth, an actual labeled region appearing in atlases, encyclopedias, and historical records with the casual certainty of France or Spain. French cartographers marked it, Dutch mapmakers referenced it, British records documented it, Russian archives mentioned Tartarian peoples, governance structures, trade routes. Then, sometime in the mid-1800s, it vanishes, not conquered, not renamed, erased. The maps are redrawn, the encyclopedias stop mentioning it, the history books pretend it never existed, but the architecture remains. Massive stone structures across Central Asia, Russia, Mongolia, buildings of impossible scale and precision, doorways sized for giants, halls that echo with vastness, all supposedly built by various empires, with no documentation, no verified construction records, no explanation for how they achieved such engineering feats with the technology supposedly available. What if the giants weren't anomalies? What if they were the administrators, the overseers, the guardian class of Tartaria? What if the architecture reflects that reality? It would explain why government buildings, courthouses, administrative centers, structures of oversight and control feature oversized proportions while residential areas remain human-scaled. Why photographs and accounts describe individuals of unusual height in positions of authority, not as merchants or common laborers. Why historical records mention them in roles of supervision and guardianship. And why, when Tartaria disappears from maps, the giant skeleton discoveries stop appearing in newspapers. Let's return to those missing bones. Throughout the 1800s and early 1900s, newspapers regularly reported that discovered skeletons were sent to the Smithsonian Institution. The pattern appears again and again. Local discovery, initial documentation, bones sent to the Smithsonian for study, and then nothing. The Smithsonian did collect skeletal remains during this period. Prior to the 1990 Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, the institution amassed over 18,000 skeletons from burial sites. But when questioned about giant remains specifically, the response is consistent. No such skeletons exist in our collections. Either the newspaper reports were fabrications, hundreds of them, across decades, in papers that documented everything else accurately, or something happened to the evidence. In 1934, Aleś Hrdlička, curator of anthropology at the Smithsonian, formally rejected the existence of a race of giants, blaming the reports on the will to believe and amateur anthropologists unfamiliar with human anatomy. His explanation was that people misidentified extinct megafauna as human remains, that mastodon bones, arranged in certain ways, could appear humanoid, that measurements were exaggerated, that the whole phenomenon was a combination of hoaxes, mistakes, and wishful thinking. And maybe that's true. Maybe every single newspaper report was wrong. Maybe every farmer, every construction worker, every local doctor who examined these remains and declared them human was mistaken. Or maybe the timing matters. Hrdlička made his definitive statement in 19... By that point, Tartaria had been gone from maps for decades. The architectural evidence had been reclassified as belonging to other civilizations. The geographic terminology had been updated. The history had been rewritten. And the physical evidence that might have complicated that narrative was missing. What disturbs me most isn't any single piece of evidence. It's the pattern, the coordination. Giant skeleton reports cluster in the decades when Tartaria disappears from official records. The discoveries stop precisely when references to advanced pre-industrial technology, begin to be omitted from historical accounts. The architectural proportions that make no sense for normal human inhabitants align with the time period when these structures were supposedly built. The missing bones were all sent to a central institution that now denies they ever existed. Not coincidence, not random variation. Pattern. And when you see the pattern, when you trace it across continents and centuries, when you watch elements appear and disappear with suspicious precision, you have to ask, what aren't we being told? Let me propose something that sounds absurd until you examine the evidence. What if the giants weren't rulers? What if they were a specialized class? Guardians, overseers, administrators of infrastructure and construction. What if their size was functional, not ceremonial? What if buildings were scaled to them because they were the ones overseeing construction and maintenance? It would explain the architectural patterns, why government buildings and administrative centers feature oversized proportions, why the scale appears in working spaces, not just ceremonial ones. It would explain the construction mysteries. How were massive stone structures built with such precision in the 1700s and 1800s? Maybe they weren't built by the civilizations we credit them to. Maybe they were built for those civilizations by a previous society that employed individuals physically capable of moving stones, operating machinery, overseeing construction at scales we consider impossible. And it would explain the systematic erasure. If you're inheriting structures you didn't build, inheriting technology you don't fully understand, inheriting architectural systems designed for a different type of human being, what do? You adapt the narrative. You claim the structures as your own. You backdate the construction records. You reclassify the builders. And you remove any physical evidence, any bones, any remains, any proof that suggests someone else was here first. Ask yourself, how many mysterious construction techniques suddenly make sense if you assume the builders were physically larger and stronger than modern humans? How many impossible engineering feats become merely difficult if the laborers stood 9 feet tall? Academic institutions don't debate the giant skeletons. They don't investigate the claims. They don't examine the evidence. They dismiss it. They categorize it as debunked. They file it under pseudo-archaeology and move on. Museums don't display the artifacts mentioned in those hundreds of newspaper reports. They don't address the discrepancy. They don't explain where the bones went. Historical societies don't investigate why Tartaria disappeared from maps, why the terminology changed, why encyclopedias rewrote their entries. The pattern repeats across disciplines, across countries, across centuries of scholarship. It's not active suppression, it's passive erasure. Questions that simply aren't asked, evidence that isn't examined, dots that aren't connected, because connecting them leads to conclusions that don't fit the established narrative. And when you point it out, when you lay the evidence side by side, the newspaper reports, the missing bones, the architectural proportions, the timing of Tartaria's disappearance, you're met with the same response. Interesting, but not significant. As if coincidence explains everything, as if patterns don't matter, as if asking why is somehow inappropriate. But the why is the entire point. Who were these people? The newspapers describe them as ordinary members of society, not circus performers, not medical curiosities on display, just people, individuals holding positions of authority, working as guards, overseers, foremen of construction projects, present in formal, official contexts, present until they weren't. The photographic record from the 1800s shows individuals of unusual height, not the manipulated digital images circulating online today, but actual period photographs, cabinet cards, formal portraits. Some show individuals 7 or 8 feet tall, standing with families of normal height. Others show them in official capacities, in uniform, in positions of responsibility. These images exist in archives. They're cataloged, they're filed away. But they're not studied, they're not investigated. They're marked as curiosities and forgotten. And maybe that's appropriate. Maybe they were just unusually tall people with medical conditions, genetic anomalies, individuals who happened to grow taller than average. Or maybe they were something else. Maybe they were the last remnants of a class, a people, a civilization that served a specific function, that built and maintained infrastructure on a scale we can barely comprehend today, that worked as the administrative and protective class for an empire that spanned continents. And maybe, when that empire disappeared, when Tartaria was erased from maps, when the terminology changed, when the history was rewritten, they disappeared with it. I keep returning to the architecture. The massive doorways remain. The oversized staircases still stand. The buildings that make no sense for normal human proportions continue to serve modern functions, their original purpose obscured by centuries of adaptive reuse. We walk through them daily without asking why. We accept the official explanations, grandeur, aesthetics, intimidation, without examining whether they actually explain anything, because examining them requires accepting that history isn't a straight line of progress, that we might be living in the remnants of something more sophisticated, something we didn't build, something we don't fully understand, that the giants in the newspaper reports weren't aberrations, but evidence of a different arrangement, a different society, a different world, a world where Tartaria existed as more than a geographic label, where massive buildings were constructed for a purpose we've forgotten, where individuals of extraordinary size served as the guardians and administrators of a civilization that built on a scale we can't replicate today. The evidence persists. The newspaper reports fill entire books. The architectural proportions remain unchanged. The timing of Tartaria's disappearance aligns precisely with when the giant discoveries stopped. But we're told to ignore it, to file it away, to accept that hundreds of newspaper reports were all mistakes, all hoaxes, all misidentifications, to accept that the architectural scale was aesthetic choice, despite the impracticality and expense, to accept that Tartaria was nothing more than a vague geographic term, despite appearing in encyclopedias with detailed descriptions of governance, peoples, and trade, to accept that all these elements clustering together in the same time period is coincidence. Maybe it is coincidence, or maybe we've inherited something we don't understand, buildings we didn't design for purposes we can't comprehend, to accept that all these elements clustering together in the same time period is coincidence. Maybe it is coincidence, or maybe we've inherited something we don't understand, buildings we didn't design for purposes we can't comprehend, a history we've chosen to forget, because remembering it would require admitting we're not the first advanced civilization on this continent, that the giants were real, that they built Tartaria, that they served as its protectors, its administrators, its guardian class, and that when the maps were redrawn and the encyclopedias rewritten, they were written out of history along with the empire they helped maintain. The massive doorways remain, waiting for someone willing to ask why they're that size. The newspaper reports persist, archived in libraries, documenting discoveries that official history denies. The bones are gone, sent to an institution that claims they never existed. But the questions remain. Who were the giants? What was their role in Tartaria? And what else vanished with them that we're still pretending was never here at all?